morning, everyone. My name is Adila Raz, and I am the Director of Afghanistan Policy Lab at Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. I am very pleased to welcome you all to today's discussion on the question of Afghanistan and America's policy impasse, especially considering that it's nearly 3 decades since the Taliban's takeover and the challenges we have been witnessing, such as the catastrophic humanitarian situation in the dire state of human rights, particularly for women and girls. With the Taliban's return to power, they began imposing severe restrictions on women and girls, depriving them from their basic rights. These restrictions include banning girls from attending school beyond grade 6 and severely limiting their participation in the workforce with very few exceptions. The country is also facing a massive wave of migration, with young people fleeing for opportunities abroad and an increase in radicalization, which are among the critical issues in Afghanistan. The rise of attacks by ISS on civilians and targeting ethnic Hazaras and Shias has raised serious concerns about the Taliban's claim of maintaining security across the country. The emergence of new global conflict has led to competing agendas, and there is often criticism regarding the lack of a clear strategy on how to deal with Taliban. With this in mind, the Afghanistan Policy Lab will be hosting a series of discussions with experts and thought leaders in the lead up to the new US administration on what could be effective foreign policy options for addressing the situation in Afghanistan. In this series, today we have two great speakers who will help us to delve deeper into these questions and provide their expert views. I am very pleased with introducing our first speaker for today, Mr. Dave Petz, who is a senior national security executive with over 4 decades of experience in challenging and critical missions, including Afghanistan, ranging from counterterrorism and special operations to regional and global affairs. Dave has a proven track record of leading and managing large and diverse teams, building lasting partnerships across the US government and with foreign allies, and delivering results in high stakes and high pressure situations. Until his retirement in October 2023, Dave served as the Assistant Director of CIA for South and Central Asia. Dave was responsible for all CIA activities and engagements across South and Central Asia and for policy coordination in Washington related to this important and very unpredictable region. Dave developed a strategic approach to critical global issues, managing a large integrated organization, build global partnerships, and ensure the safety and welfare of officers in high-risk areas. I must also mention that Dave was also based in Afghanistan. Our second speaker is Mr. Lutfullah Najafizadeh, a known journalist and the CEO of AMU TV. At AMU, Najafizadeh and his colleagues are trying to revitalize free press in Afghanistan by connecting Afghan journalists in exile with those who are inside the country and providing free and unbiased reporting for Afghan people. Lutfullah's nearly 2 decades of journalism experience includes working and leading Tolo News TV. Among many recognitions, One Young World awarded him the Journalist of the Year for 2022. Paris-based Reports Without Borders awarded him with the Medal of Press Freedom Hero in 2016. Time magazine profiled him as a next generation global leader in 2016, and Forbes magazine selected him among the 30 under 30 Asia influencers in media in 2017. Najafizadeh was the only Afghan journalist who attended 2 rounds of civil society talks with Taliban in Doha in 2019 and in Oslo in 2022. And he was also recently in Doha too, and we will have a couple of questions for him in regards to Doha 3 as well. So with this in mind, I'm going to start with you, Dave. You recently published a very important and a very critical article, which is the title is Afghanistan, a Lost Cause for America. And it had raised a lot of great conversation among Afghans and policymakers. And I think for us today, your perspective and views would be really, really critical. And so I really want to know, what do you think the current US, UN, and international engagements with the Taliban is, and is it working? And if it's not, why not? And if it is working, why? So hear your perspective, you and your view, because in your article, I liked it and I loved it. And I think this really goes to so many of us who read it, that you had like a longer perspective of how the 20 years of investment in Afghanistan, it could be lost, but there is a way to still move forward and protect those gains. And as your bio said, you were among the most senior US officials at the time in the ground. You served in Afghanistan, and you were among the very few last ones who had left and had seen the recent developments. So your views would be very important for us, and I'm sure it will be also very critical for policymakers. So we'll start with you in that question.
Good morning, and thank you, Adela, for the invitation. And it's great to be here with all of you. And I really, just sort of looking at the screen here, I see there's a lot of very smart, experienced people here. So I'll do my best to rise to that occasion. So as to the question of if that interaction with the Taliban is working, I think the obvious answer is that it's not working. And there's probably several reasons for that from my perspective, but certainly I think there could be some others. And I think the first is, we really don't have any leverage over the Taliban. We haven't really laid out a way forward as to what our expectations are. And by our expectations, I mean the international community that requires the Taliban to do things. So there are no consequences for what the Taliban, or very few consequences for what the Taliban does or fails to do in response to requests from the international community. I think that's one. The second is that we haven't fully coordinated as an international community to deal with the Taliban. So we will hear countries say the Taliban must have an inclusive government. We will hear countries criticize the Taliban for women's rights and girls' education and other issues. But that's it. We hear these statements. And what we haven't done is turn that international community where we have these common concerns into a common voice with common expectations for the Taliban. And I think until we do that, this process where we're engaging with the Taliban in sort of a transactional way isn't going to work. In fact, I think the longer it takes for us to sort of get organized as an international community with one voice and one set of expectations for the Taliban, the more likely it is that countries will begin to normalize relations with the Taliban just based on their own needs, that this is a practical approach and we have to go our own way because there's not a broader international effort. And I think the last piece of this, and maybe the most important why it's not working, is we're only talking to the Taliban, right? I think the Taliban's priority is survival of the regime. I don't think their concern is the welfare of Afghans. So I don't think they speak for all Afghans inside of Afghanistan, and they certainly don't speak for the tens of thousands of Afghans who are displaced and now in exile around the country, around the world. We need to hear from Afghans who can speak for and represent all Afghans everywhere. And I think we know those Afghans. They are everywhere. They're here in the United States, and they're in Europe, and they're in other places. I think that group of Afghans represents the legitimate political opposition to the Taliban, and I think we should recognize a group of Afghans as that and enable them and empower them. And every time there's a UN meeting to talk to the Taliban, we should have that group there to represent all of the interest of all Afghans everywhere. So in summary, quickly, I think those are three reasons why it's not working.
Thank you. Thank you. I will have definitely follow-up questions, but I want to come to Mr. Najafi Zadalullah. Your reaction to what Dave said and your reflection, and especially I think Dave did mention the UN role, and then I think we're in this prep of the third Doha in the absence of the Afghan voices as well. So how to react to that?
I think it's unfortunate, that the international community is somehow forced to deal with the Taliban. And it is a very transactional engagement. There is a vacuum, a void, and a lack of policy across the Western world in particular on how to deal with Afghanistan. And I'm afraid that is the policy, not to have a policy. And that allows certain countries to prioritize very transactional approaches, whether that's the United States or Western Europe, to deal with the Taliban on day-to-day stuff, and at the same time hoping that constructive engagement or positive engagement, as they explain, would leverage the Taliban to change for the better, which hasn't produced the desirable outcome in the past 2.5 to 3 years. So I think it's a vacuum, I would say. The way things unfolded in Afghanistan, and things have progressed in the past 2.5 years, and the way that the international community has been dealing with Afghanistan is not very coherent. And the Doha process, a lot of us probably hoped that it was the beginning of something. But it reminds us every day, now that we are approaching the third one, that it's going to be a very difficult process, and certainly a very long one.
Both you and Dave mentioned that, and Dave, this question comes to you too. You both raised this element of absence of coherent voice, coherent approach, coherent agenda towards how to deal with, or a policy towards how to deal with Taliban. And then you both kind of emphasized, in terms of what you, Dave, mentioned, that does not basically much exist from the US with the international community together to deal and have an approach towards the Taliban. And you also mentioned Lutfullah, that the international community overall does not have, and it looks like countries and member states are going in a very ad hoc process, considering their own national insecurity priorities. Building that bridge, how is that possible? Because we do understand the absence of it, but how do you bring that synergy? And what could be your advice? Where do you see that common interests could emerge? Could it be the competition over not to normalize fast, or could it be really the security challenges? I'm going to start with you, Dave. That security element is something that I have not heard much from experts explaining the type of risks that are coming from Afghanistan right now, or are being triggering in the region.
I think you're asking me, Adela, about how could we enable sort of the emergence of a international approach to the Taliban, if I got your question right. I think there were several.
Correct. How do we create that synergy?
Yeah.
Because we mentioned the synergy does not exist.
Yeah, when I listen to the UN talk about this, and the Secretary General, they laid out a very general criteria that, look, we will not normalize or recognize the Taliban until these things happen. But it's a bit soft and it's a bit vague. I mean, the right words are in there, but it doesn't have a forcing function. It isn't meant to compel the Taliban to do anything. And I think, and quite frankly, I'll just say the U.S. should be leading on this as well. The U.S. and the UN and other countries who want to take a lead on this, I think, can come up with these things that we know are important for Afghans everywhere, and regional stability and security, and undermining terrorism from the region. And it gets to this inclusive government that everyone has asked for. It gets to equal rights for all Afghans. It gets for secure borders. It gets for, access to humanitarian aid and medical aid for everyone in Afghanistan. Those things, I think, allow Afghanistan to begin to grow and prosper. I think a lot of changes have to take place for that to happen. But I think there has to be a will from the United Nations, the United States, and other countries to lay out to fill that vacuum. I completely agree with that. To lay out a plan that we all agree is acceptable. The Taliban's not going to like it. It's going to require them to do some things, but it would also require us to do some things if the Taliban could agree and we can begin to move forward to, I think, change the nature of the government in Afghanistan so it is more responsive to its own citizens and it's more responsive to the requests and the coordination from the international community. It's not an easy process, but I think what's lacking and to the point about there being a vacuum, we have to have a serious discussion, United States, United Nations, and our international partners on what are the things we must see from the Taliban in order to move forward, and what are we willing to do in response to that.
And I like when you said US being in the lead, because I think there is the recent conversation is a lot where the UN is in the lead, and I think that's a great partner as well. But I like your perspective in terms of identifying why US needs to be in the lead. And coming to you, Lutfullah, just again with a reflection to this, where we talked about the coherence does not exist, and Dave mentioned that if there is a coherence, that's basically a stronger leverage we have towards Taliban in order to create the right pressure. But your perspective, how that coherence could be created, because that's where we're all kind of banging our head towards the wall and say, how do we merge the international community towards one specific and centralized agenda to create that pressuring point?
I think it starts with redefining the relationship between Afghanistan and the United States. When we talk about the US, we talk about the US with this perception of 20 years of engagement in Afghanistan, excessive presence, boots on the ground, trillions of dollars. That we're not dealing with that US anymore. I think for Afghans in particular, the sooner we wake up from that dream, the better it is for us. Second is also the shift in the US policies and global priorities. We're not talking about counterterrorism a lot these days. I mean, Dave is on the call. He can probably elaborate more. There has been a shift to strategic competition from a US perspective, the war in Ukraine, the Middle East crisis in particular in the past 6 months. I think this has absorbed a lot of energy, and I don't think Afghanistan is really mentioned enough in the halls of power in the US, as well as elsewhere in Europe as well. So redefining, I think, that balance, that relationship is probably step number one. What is Afghanistan? What does it have to offer to the US? Why it should be relevant? And also, I think it's also for us to sell it basically to the United States that Afghanistan can be a partner. Afghanistan under the Taliban can be a partner. Afghanistan under the Taliban can be a threat. That's why the US should reintervene. Post-Taliban Afghanistan is something that the US should be interested. So I think these are a lot of questions, a lot of strategic long-term questions that I don't think the United States, particularly now, have the bandwidth to really even discuss it. Forget about this coming up with a long-term strategy. So that's why I think we're coming back to the transactional politics that I explained in the first place. Okay, how are we going to get the 84,000 SIV applicants out of Afghanistan? How are we going to get some money into NGOs to help with education, for instance? How are we going to help with limited over-the-horizon counterterrorism operations, for instance? So these are some of the very daily engagements that exist. For a broader coherent strategy, Ambassador, I think it's important. It's important, first of all, for us as Afghans to redefine this relationship and to engage with the United States in a way that it also ensures the U.S. interest. So we can't just go to the U.S. and say, "Hey, you are in Afghanistan for 20 years, and you have this obligation to remain in Afghanistan for another 20 years." I think that in the past 2.5 years, it has proven to all of us that it's not going to work. There is a decline in engagement with Afghanistan. You know that the level of commitment to Afghanistan's humanitarian appeal is less than 30%. I think it's 16%. So that is a huge indicator on about significance of Afghanistan on the world map.
I'm going to come on this question of the among Afghans, the narratives and the type of strategy or thoughts that it needs to be built among the community itself. But I want to come back to Dave on the critical question that Lutfullah raised, which is the element of the counterterrorism. So I wanted to know what are the rising security challenges that you do see from Afghanistan to the region and outside? And as I mentioned earlier, this whole security debate somehow seems to drop down only to the element of ISS. And I think it would be great to hear your perspective, Dave, just knowing your background and your work experience before.
Yeah, thanks. Those are great points raised. And so I do want to come back to a couple of them because I think it gives me an opportunity to raise a couple other points. But and I completely agree that we have to be able to communicate with the U.S. government about Afghanistan in a different way. It can't just be there's a counterterrorism crisis in Afghanistan, let's go solve it. That is not a mature way to look at the relations between the United States and another country, where we're only worried about putting out a fire or managing some national security crisis. I think everyone knows on this call that our terrorism concerns for Afghanistan have not gone away. In fact, there's a lot of discussion going on in Washington today, even, and I've seen other podcasts from Mike Morrell and others about, the red lights blinking. We've heard the FBI director talking about that as well. So we know the threat from ISIS that's coming from ISIS, and that is ISIS-K, is real. It's a real threat inside of Afghanistan, in the region, in Europe, and to the United States. And so I think that is on the radar. And Lutfullah is right that, look, there's only so much bandwidth in Washington, and we tend to look at the big things. There's so many big things going on. And we have to find a way to communicate about Afghanistan in a way that keeps it relevant based on where we are today. And I think that is possible. I think that's a matter of who is communicating to the government on that. So certainly ISIS-K is still a threat. There's a lot of discussion going on about where is Al-Qaeda? Is Al-Qaeda still relevant? Is it a threat? I think there are people who are banging the drums loudly that Al-Qaeda still poses a threat. I'd really love to hear the latest assessment from the IC on that. But we know that Al-Qaeda is still inside of Afghanistan, and we know the Taliban has a long history of enabling and supporting Al-Qaeda. In many cases, Al-Qaeda is married into Taliban families and those sorts of things. That's a very complicated issue, and we should not expect that to just go away quietly. We should keep all eyes on what is going on with Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. But the other thing is we still have ungoverned space. We have potential for safe haven. The potential for terrorist recruitment is high in those areas of Afghanistan and around the border. We just saw the issue with the Tajiks that have been recruited to try to come into the United States, and the potential for a more violent extremism to pour across the borders from Afghanistan into those other countries is a real threat, and we know they're very concerned about that. But underlying all that is those are the kind of things that until we can resolve them, keeps Afghanistan an unsafe place for Afghans. I mean, humanitarian aid can't get where it needs to be. Economic development will be stifled for a long time unless we can resolve these issues. Afghanistan's relations with its neighbors will continue to be a problem. Refugees will pour across the borders. So there are so many issues connected. It is not just a security issues, but that certainly complicates the many other issues that Afghanistan is facing today. And if I could just go on just for one more minute, I think one of the things I'd love for us to be able to hear from, there are many groups, Afghan groups that have come together to try to foster a better way forward for Afghanistan. I think they're doing great work. They're humanitarian groups, or some groups that want to see some political change, women's groups, education groups, and those sorts of things. But I think what we have is like 1,000 voices, and those voices aren't harmonized. And I would love to see a group come together that could unite with, collaborate with, and speak for, to the extent possible, all of those groups. So these groups could go and walk the halls in Washington, could speak before Congress, could speak to the White House, could speak to the large NGOs here, could talk to the private sector, could do the same thing. I think until we can have a smaller group that represents all Afghans, the ability to carry that right message to the U.S. government and to the UN and the European capitals is going to be limited. So I admire the great work all these groups are doing. There has to be a way to bring that together so that becomes more of a single voice, a louder voice. And I think with that, it gets more credibility and more support.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'm coming to you, Lutfullah. I think it's just like a perfect segment, because this is what I had in mind also to ask, because there has been this emphasis on a unified voice from Afghans in order to really represent or identify the priority issues for the country, for the future of Afghanistan. And I also looked into your article, Dave. You did mention something like the suggestion to be an influential Afghans who can speak for all and represent all, and who can speak with the international community and also negotiate with Taliban. And I kind of looked into put all this together, and I said, I'm going to ask Lutfullah, do you think that is possible? Do you think we do need it, what Dave mentioned, that cohesive voice, that influential voices from within Afghans that would be able to speak with the international community and, keep in mind, be able to negotiate with Taliban? So I'm going to come to you, Lutfullah, your reflection and your thought on this.
I mean, the studies that I have seen, even under the Taliban, is that the approval rating for democracy and for election is 70% in Afghanistan. I think that is, a very unanimous, I would say, Afghan voice on what kind of lifestyle the Afghan people want. I mean, ultimately, there is a fight, on which direction we want the country to pursue. And there has been, I would say, a very unanimous voice around education. And that is something I think it's important for all of us to acknowledge and understand and appreciate, that this so-called, quote unquote, tribal, backward, anti-education sort of society is calling for education. That is something for all of us, I think, to appreciate and possibly change our colonial understanding of Afghanistan. So that's one. I think the unity in vision, the unity in purpose, is one thing. That and then the unity in messaging and the unity in communication and representation of certain groups is the other. I think the way that we see Afghanistan as a country where there are different ethnic groups, different interest groups, different parts of the country, and unity can only exist if these groups come together. To somebody like me, that is fundamentally flawed. Because I don't represent that. I certainly don't represent. I don't see my personal interest in that. So and I don't think your young fellows on this call should see their interest in that division of Afghanistan. So if we mean by unity, bringing certain individuals and interest groups to basically come with a power sharing arrangement, that is a quick fix solution for Afghanistan, and for how many times you want to see that experimented. Last we've seen it in Bonn 23 years ago, and I think Doha was also another attempt to do that. So I think it's important for all of us to step back and build on that set of Afghan values that the young population of Afghanistan, 2/3 under 25, that they believe in. If we come up with a list of values that we think that the majority of the Afghan population subscribe themselves to it, then that is our purpose. And then we have to communicate around that, rather than simplifying Afghanistan into this traditional way of forging unity and bringing stability. I think someone told me years ago, one of the diplomats in the region said that you have been. He was complaining. He was blaming the U.S. for managing Afghanistan for long rather than fixing Afghanistan. So I think we have to think about sort of real factors of stability for long term, and what are some of these challenges that we face as a nation, and that has to be addressed. So this is first an Afghan internal question for us to come together and discuss that, particularly younger Afghans.
Mhm.
And then around that, we engage with the wider international community.
Absolutely. I think this question comes a lot along, and there is quite a challenge, and I think an acknowledgement of the diversity of view in Afghanistan, especially with the younger generation. And I think that's where exactly I would say the element of democracy is inherited, in sense of how do we need to learn to respect different political views. And then at the same time, as you mentioned, Lutfullah, identifying those 4, 5, 6 top priorities. And it's somehow even unannounced that those top 4, 5 priorities kind of correlated and coordinated and identified by every Afghan, no matter from what type of background they arrive. So thank you for responding to this question. And I do see a lot of hands being raised, and I see questions are popping up. So I'm going to go to my last round of questions, and I think that's really the most critical one for you, Dave, and then I will come to you, Lutfullah, as well. It's really this larger question, and we tapped on it in the beginning too. What could be the foreign policy options for Afghanistan under the new US administration post the upcoming presidential election? Because I think in this midst of somehow gray space, it would be extremely critical we do identify 1, 2, or 3, or 4 top priorities for the US new administration on how to focus on, how to identify, and how to have the approach towards Afghanistan, because that's where the criticism does arrive in a way. So I'm going to start with you, Dave, and then I'll come to you, Lutfullah, your recommendation as well.
Yeah, I think one of the policy sort of the policy statements we might see on Afghanistan, or we should see on Afghanistan in the new administration, is that Afghanistan remains a national security priority for the United States. And I think, we didn't leave Afghanistan because we had resolved all the issues there. We left abruptly and in a chaotic way. And in fact, we created many issues on the way out. So I think there are many unresolved issues in Afghanistan that will keep it on the radar for some period of time until it is a stable state and in peace with all of its neighbors. I think that would be one. I think the second thing is, as I suggested in the paper, and I know it's sort of a long shot, is we should work with the UN and the international community and make it U.S. policy as well, that we want to see a change to a more inclusive government in Afghanistan. And that would mean individuals who are not in Afghanistan now, there would be a way for them to join that government so it represents all of the Afghans and the needs and wishes of the Afghans, as Lutfullah has laid out. And the third would be that in order to enable those policy objectives, we would enable and support the legitimate political Afghan opposition, whatever that turns out to be. So there is a voice heard in Washington and in New York and in European capitals, a legitimate voice for all Afghans everywhere. Now, again, that sounds a little naive, but those are the things I would advocate my colleagues in Washington to look at as priorities for the next administration.
Thank you. And Lutfullah, your thoughts on that? You're muted.
I think it will certainly be an opportunity for the US after the elections to revisit the Afghanistan file. I'm not expecting a major shift in the US policy under Biden or Trump. I think the United States will have an opportunity to break from this trauma of withdrawal after the elections to sort of have a fresh look, if possible, and to see if It can engage with Afghanistan in a way that's more proactive, and can certainly lead certain initiatives that have not been in the case in the past couple of years. I think the US seems to be relying a lot more on the UN and other mechanisms rather than taking the lead for Afghanistan. So that would certainly be an opportunity. But also, I think, I mean, the US has a very reactionary foreign policy. So it depends how Taliban unfold, how progress in Afghanistan will trigger US foreign policy vis-a-vis Afghanistan. I think whether that's on a counterterrorism file or humanitarian file or other regional instability, I would say. I think TTP is another great concern. Is another great also example of how Taliban is dealing with international terrorist groups. So those things can affect. Otherwise, I can, my understanding is that the US will maintain a limited humanitarian interest in Afghanistan, a limited counterterrorism interest in Afghanistan or on Afghanistan from the region. But also depends who will be the national security advisor in the US, who will be the new Secretary of State, who will be the new Secretary of Defense. I don't think that the US president, even in the next administration, will have Afghanistan on his desk. But if, let's say, a former ambassador in Afghanistan becomes Secretary of State and then he wants to try certain things without really creating national issues for the next US president, you might see some activities. But I hope I'm wrong. I hope that the US will begin a review of Afghanistan after 3-4 years to see how it can correct certain things that's still possible.
Thank you, and I'm going to open the floor to our discussants who are here for their questions and their reflections, and I hope they also tap on one of the really critical questions we didn't have time to tap on, the relevancy of Afghanistan, and I think the whole regional dynamics and the element and the role of China as well. So I hope they will be raising that question from our speakers. I'm going to start with Rahmati, sit with you as one of Afghanistan Policy Lab fellows and former diplomat of Afghanistan. So Mr. Rahmati, the floor is yours. And then Mr. Hiwat, I will give you the floor, Hiwat Suleiman Khil, to raise your question and reflection to the panelists.
Well, thank you. I would like to also thank our panelists for this really great discussion. I'd like to begin by echoing what Najib said, and that is to demand Afghans to unite the way we are demanded now to unite is overburdening us. It's not really a legitimate thing to ask the Afghans, because look at the US. Is United States united in the way they are expecting Afghans to unite? We do have parties, we do have difference of opinion in the United States. So I think it's legitimate to request the Afghans to have shared values, and we do have shared values, and to come up with a list of shared values. That's probably something that the Afghans can quickly do. But to demand that every Afghan should demand the same thing and to come on the same page with every other Afghan is something that overburdens us, and that takes us further away from coming to a kind of a starting point to find a solution for Afghanistan. My question is to Dave, and I'll start by stating what Mr. Najib just mentioned, and that's the policy to have no policy for Afghanistan. And I want to pose a critical question that if President Biden has anything to do with that policy to have no policy for Afghanistan. This critical question is founded on several instances indicating President Biden's potentially negative sentiments towards Afghanistan, which collectively raise concerns about the nature of US engagement and the strategic goals in the region. And if I may, very briefly mentioning some of those instances. On January 2023, in a statement, President Biden skeptically remarked that raise your hand.
You said 2 minutes.
It's quick. because I think these evidences are important, because President Biden asked a group of reporters, raise your hand if you think anyone was going to unify Afghanistan. In November 2022, President Biden referred to Afghanistan as a God-forsaken place. And since August 2021, we have seen multiple accounts from senior US generals and advisors that highlighted President Biden on his decision to withdraw from Afghanistan was almost alone. Like everyone was against that decision to withdraw from Afghanistan the way we withdrew. And then lastly, the speculation on policy engagement with Afghanistan that, early 2022, there were some reports surfaced that President Biden doesn't want to see. He instructed the US Department of State that he doesn't want to see a policy memo on Afghanistan, concerning Afghanistan. So given these points, should President Biden be responsible on maintaining a policy of detachment towards Afghanistan and a policy of no policy towards Afghanistan? And secondly, can we expect that Afghanistan gets an Afghan policy under President Biden if he is extended into the next term? Thank you.
Suleiman Khail said 2 minutes, please, because we have amazing questions coming up from our participants online as well, and I really wanted to tap on those two.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I like when Dave said that the Taliban are not representing all Afghanistan, all people of Afghanistan. But I will push back on the point. I also read the article that Dave wrote. I will push back on the point that he says that we know the real representative of Afghanistan. I think we should be very careful when we are using these phrases in the context of Afghanistan, like the Afghan people, the real representative of Afghan people. I think we often use these terms in the context of Afghanistan as we're discussing a country like the US. In the US, we know of the population size, the election system that reflects the people's desires somewhat. In Afghanistan, we barely know the exact population. We don't have a clear understanding of what the people want. So I think banging on the table and debating the Taliban that we are the real representative of Afghanistan and they are not, I think we're dismissing the real issue, that actually this is the issue that we're discussing. We don't have the mechanism to accurately reflect the will of the Afghan people, and we should be pushing the Taliban to come to this point. And if you're claiming the same thing that they are, actually we're dismissing, we're missing the main point, I think. And I agree with Mr. Lutfullah, and I'm glad he's here, and that we have certain values, common values that we can find and work on those. I have a question for Lutfullah, but if I have the chance, I'll ask it later.
Thank you. I think we'll stop here. And Mr. Suleiman Khail, you come from as a student from Columbia University, so just right.
Correct.
So just a quick introduction on you. So I will hand
If I could,
please.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a quick statement about when I said we know who they are. I don't mean by name. I meant sort of in a general way that there are so many well-qualified, experienced, and educated Afghans all over the world who don't play a role currently in discussions with the Taliban. So I mean the vast amount of Afghans who are not involved in the current process. So I mean generally, when I say generally, we know who they are, I mean those people who are certainly not represented now, but have certainly the capacity and the capability to be represented in those discussions.
Great. And Lutfullah, any reaction to the two questions, and then we can go to the questions from the audience. And whichever you choose to respond, and the same thing, Dave, with you, whichever you choose to respond.
You're very nice. Thank you. On the question of unity, I think on the matters that there is measurable unity within the Afghan society, whether that's education, or for instance, call for gender apartheid in Afghanistan, I don't see a response from the international community. So where there is unity, at least that's something that, the international community should react to it. And that is something I think for all of us to to also measure our own expectations as the Afghan people from others to come and do everything for us. I think that's also something that we have to debate internally. Let's not forget the fact that the very foundation of Afghan leadership and Afghan ownership in the past 20 years were taken from us. And that was something probably as one of the fundamental lessons I think that we all should learn and reflect upon.
Thank you. And I see you, Nazila, raising your hands. 2 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And thank you very much, Dave and Lutfullah, for honoring us today with this discussion. Thanks, Dave, very much for being a great ally. As you all mentioned, all the crises around the world, and contesting issues, it has been, for me as an actor and an activist immersed in the field, it has been very hard to navigate, and it has taken a toll on all of us. Sort of navigating this and sort of working to internationalize the cause in Afghanistan, and that the implications are beyond us as well, and the implications are much more international, as you all very much pointed out. I just want to come back to the point that Hewat Shalom Khail made. He's a friend from Colombia, and we have had discussions about this as well. Taliban. I just want to point this out, that Taliban does not represent me or any woman or girl deprived of education right now in Afghanistan. And we also have to be very careful when we are saying that, oh, we do not know, and Taliban somehow represents some population in Afghanistan, because as you very well said, Hewat, there has not been a census, a poll on whether or not Taliban represent Afghans. And I think we have to be very careful with that, because it has done so much harm than good, and it has legitimized the Taliban more than ever. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And just a quick intro, Nazila is also one of our fellows at the Afghanistan Policy Lab. And so before I gave it to you, Dave and Lutfullah, I don't know if you have had the chance to look into the questions, but we do have a question from Dr. Winfrey. He's one of our constant supporters at the Afghanistan Policy Lab. He attends a lot of our meetings. So his question is really in the element of education. And what he says is that it seems that the leader, Haibatullah Akhundzadeh, is most powerful. He seems to resist any foreign influences and appears to be very strict on girls' and women's education. How can that be influenced? And then the second question we have from one of the attendees, it says, within the US are the best points of access, where are within the US the best points of access in the US government for Afghan civil society in Afghanistan and in the diaspora? So I feel, Lutfullah, that goes to you. And we have a question from Zulekha Akrami. She says, we all know that currently the US is not following war and terror foreign policy at all. What is the current position of US and UN Security Council? Which I think we answered this to a certain level. And then the UN Doha meeting seems that US is in the back, and US just wants to basically push the UN up front. And then we have another question is from Saifullah Atai. A question from Najafi Zada Saib. Considering the restrictive environment under Taliban regime, what stories or perspectives do you think are being underreported in the international media regarding the current situation in Afghanistan? So I leave it to you, Lutfullah and Dave, and I give you Dave first the floor, and then Lutfullah you to respond.
Wow, I don't know. There's a lot of questions there. I don't. You have one of those you would want me to address?
I think the question of Haibatullah, I think that's one really, comes more.
But I'd love to hear. I'd love to hear Lutfullah's thoughts on that. I mean, just from my time sort of observing Haibatullah, he sort of came out of nowhere from an international perspective, and we didn't know a lot about him, at least internationally, until the Taliban took over, and then there he was. And then I think we were all surprised by sort of the harsh edicts and sort of walking back some of the things that we thought were going to take place. And I think he sort of sits in an echo chamber of people around him who have very similar views, and to the point he doesn't always listen to, some of his senior members of the government who seem to have a more moderate view on some things. I don't know that you can influence him directly, and I think the influence might be if there's a coordinated international effort where the Taliban have to do certain things in order to see some concessions from the international community. those pressures on those other leaders around him might, in fact, have a way to influence him. I say that knowing he has been pretty resistant to their overtures to make some changes. So I think influencing Hibatullah is really a complex issue, and I'd love to hear Lutfullah's thoughts on that.
I think he can be influenced probably the same way that you can influence Kim Jong-un or Khamenei or, you know, I don't know who else. I mean, there isn't much you can do about him, to be very honest with you. I think the Qatari Prime Minister was probably the only foreign leader who visited Kandahar that's known and met with him. There were other, I think, initiatives taking place, testing his strength, leadership strength, such as allowing Mullah Omar's son to travel, having a head of a state level protocol in the UAE and in Qatar last year, and this year for Siraj Haqqani. I think these are attempts basically to influence the Taliban supreme leader as a serious answer. I'm not sure how can he be influenced. I think that's but the immediate reaction that we see is that he consolidates power and he becomes more authoritarian and controls day-to-day affairs of government in Kabul as well, which is also reflected in the UN Secretary General's recent report as well.
Thank you. And in the interest of time, I think I'm somehow going to assume that the questions that were raised, we did answer, because when I looked at it carefully, somehow we have tapped on it. And apologies for if we have not answered the questions directly. But I would like to go ahead and hand it over to my colleague, Mr. Dr. Aryan Sharifi, to conclude today's meeting and provide his concluding remark. But before handing it over to him, I'm going to share his impressive bio. Dr. Aryan Sharifi is a lecturer and co-chair of the Master of and Public Policy program in Princeton University School of Public and International Affairs. Mr. Sharifi has a decade of high-level practical experience in Afghanistan and internationally, having served in multiple positions in the former Afghan government, notably as a Director General of National Threat Assessment in the Office of National Security Council, and as well as a senior advisor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Kabul. He worked on issues related to national, regional, global security, and he was the pen holder for the drafting of various national level policies and strategies, including national threat assessment and national security policy. At the international level, Mr. Sharifi worked as an analyst for Combating Terrorism Center at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and as Operation Research Analyst for the International Center for Political Violence and Terrorism Research in Singapore. Mr. Sharifi, I'm going to hand it over to you and for your concluding remarks, and my gratitude to you, Dave, and my gratitude to you, Lutfullah, for this very engaging conversation. And I can see the questions are still popping up, which means we have raised a lot of interest, and that's a great reflection. But Dr. Sharifi, please take the floor.
Thank you, Safir Saib. What a great discussion, honestly, really so concise, so to the point. And of course, it doesn't come as a surprise. Lutfullah has been a friend, a very good friend for a long time. And of course, I've known of Dave for quite a while. Yes, those CIA guys think people don't know them, but we know you. But joking aside, no, I have immense respect for Dave and his colleagues and some of the things that they do, having worked with some of them myself. It is both easy and challenging to really conclude the issue, because the discussion was so full. There's so much material in it, yet it was so concise that I could take some points. So I took 5 points that I thought were sort of sticking out as the main themes for discussion in this entire over the past almost 1 hour. Point number one that I took was that, of course, the status quo is really not working. Now, if we recall, when the Taliban took over almost 3 years ago, the United States government was presented with 3 general policy options. Policy going forward, of course, policy was policy of recognition, the Taliban, policy of isolation, or the policy of opposition. So the US government, in a way, sort of took the policy of isolation. They didn't really oppose the Taliban, didn't recognize the Taliban, but somehow chose the policy of isolation. And that policy of isolation really is not bearing the fruits that were expected. So the status quo is really not working, and there has to be some change. Now, to bring that change, the problem is, point number 2, is that the international community, including the United States, has a lack of policy. Has a lack of clear policy and coordination with regard to Afghanistan. And as Lutfullah said very nicely, the policy is actually not to have a policy. And so that is an issue here that really needs to be changed. Point number 3, to bring that change, one of the most important things, as David mentioned, and also Lutfullah agreed, is that there has to be a will on the part of the United States and the international community in general to really engage with Afghanistan, to really bring Afghanistan back into the discussion, have a clear policy towards that. And there needs to be coordination among the international actors on a unified point and unified approach with regard to Afghanistan and with regard to the Taliban. Point number 4 is to do so, there has to be a redefinition of the United States and Afghanistan relationship. As Lutfullah mentioned, and also Dave agreed, is why there has to be a clarification on why the United States specifically should really care about Afghanistan. Now, here I'm going to interject a little bit of my own reflections here. And I think there are at least 4 reasons why the US should really still care about Afghanistan. Reason number 1 is there is a moral obligation. We like it or not, the United States government has a moral obligation towards the American citizens, which suffered over close to 7,000 deaths and close to 14,000 injuries in Afghanistan, and $2.5 trillion in tax payments. So there is a moral obligation towards American citizens, and there is a moral obligation towards the Afghan citizens for obvious reasons, as we know. Number 2, there is the issue of international prestige for the United States. I mean, for God's sake, the US went in there in that country and fought for 2 decades and then got out, and this fiasco happened. And so restoring a little bit, to the extent possible, that international standing and prestige of the United States is an important thing in my view. Number 3, there are hard interests of the United States at stake here. Still, with regard to Afghanistan, there's the issue of security. We talked about a little bit, the terrorism, et cetera, et cetera. There's the issue of organized crime and drugs. There's economics interests. Really, the U.S. is, in my observations in Central Asia, I've been traveling frequently for a long time. The West in general is investing heavily in Central Asia. On the other hand, we have the Indian subcontinent, and really the only land bridge between these 2 big economic hubs is Afghanistan, and the US has a lot of economic interests in there. So there are hard interests to be said. And finally, point number 4 is, and that's the good news in my view, that whatever the United States would do, the policy to influence in a positive way the Afghan situation is not going to be very costly for the United States. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but I have some thoughts in really talking to a lot of people, a lot of Afghans in diaspora, even talking to some top leadership of the Taliban on an ongoing basis. This is not going to be expensive. It's going to be relatively inexpensive for the US. And so finally, point number 5 that I got out of this discussion is what really specifically should the United States policy as we go towards the elections and as we will face a new administration should be. Now, Dave mentioned 3 main points. Number 1 is that Afghanistan should remain, and in fact is and should remain, a national security issue for the United States. Number 2 is that the US should really push for that inclusive government, for the formation of an inclusive government in Afghanistan, in which perhaps the Taliban will definitely need to be part of that, but also non-Taliban Afghans will also need to be part of that. 3, that there needs to be support, U.S. recognition and support for legitimate opposition to the Taliban outside of Afghanistan. And this issue, the matter of unity came up, and Lutfullah had a very interesting idea saying that unity among the Afghan opposition, Afghan political elite, should no longer be around a person or figure, but it should be around ideas and a set of Afghan values, which I really liked. And finally, the last recommendation on U.S. foreign policy towards Afghanistan is that the U.S. should take the lead. And ramp up international support for a unified approach toward Afghanistan. I'll stop here. I thought, or of course, there was a lot more points, but in the interest of time, I just took out these 5 points, and I hope that it did reflect some of the main themes that the two great speakers presented here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Saif Sharifi, for this excellent summary of today's conversation and your reflection as well. Gratitude once again to the wonderful speakers and thought leaders today we had in this really engaging conversation. My gratitude also to the participants and their active participation in the question they had raised, and apologies if we weren't able to answer them directly, but for your information, the recording of today's conversation will be available online at the Afghanistan Policy Lab site. And also thanks to my team and our fellows. We do hope that these conversation will be a source of information for everyone who had heard us and listened to us. And hopefully in the upcoming year, we will have better and greater focused approach towards one of the critical challenges of the US foreign policies, and of course, an important elements for the Afghans overall who lives inside the country and those who are outside. So thank you once again, and hope to have you in our future discussion. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Lutfullah. This conversation is ended. Thanks. Bye.